Come with me as once more we delve into English medieval social history. What were they eating? Hi guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. Okay, now we're continuing on with the discussion we started last Sunday, looking at food and food production and food preservation. So, last week we looked at production and preservation, and we only had a cursory look at it, and I really do mean a cursory look at what kind of foods were being produced. Now we're going to have a quick look at what was being eaten. Now obviously it depended on what class of society you belonged to, as to what kind of foods were available to you. But generally speaking, apart from in times of famine, for instance the Great Famine of 1315, if you ignore times of famine, everybody had as much to eat as they needed. Maybe not as much as they would like, but they definitely had as much as they would need. For instance, even beggars, and those who were unable to work for whatever reason, lepers, cripples, people like that, they were still looked after, and they still had the wherewithal to actually get at least one decent meal a day, simply by going to a local abbey or a local church or a local monastery, something like that. There would also always be food available. In some circumstances, they could even go and knock on the kitchen door of the local manor and get something. People were actually quite supportive of people within the greater general society. But what were they eating? Well, at the bottom rung, if you were a beggar and you went to a monastery or an abbey or somewhere like that, you would probably, in all likelihood, be given a bowl of something that would be called gruel. Sounds like cruel, but gruel. And basically what that was a thin soup which was made with half water, half milk generally, sometimes all milk, but generally half milk, half water. And it was used to boil up various grains such as wheat, barley, rye, things like that, to create a thin soup. But it was nourishing. Sometimes, if you were lucky, there might be something else put in there, like a little bit of bacon or something like that. But generally speaking, it was enough to keep you going. They've actually done studies of what sort of calorific value these gruels had. And it's estimated it was between 800 and 1200 calories per bowlful. So even though it might not be the most satisfying of foods, it would keep you going. And if need be, if you're in the right place, and if you were fit enough, you could even wangle it so you could have 2 or 3 meals a day just by going from one church to another, or from one priory or abbey to another. Depends on how fit you were. Now the next rung up from that would be, for instance, serfs, tenant farmers, people like that, ordinary everyday folk. And for the most part, they would have something called a pottage, which I've mentioned before, and that was basically a vegetable stew that was on the go, on the pot, on the fire, all day, every day. And that didn't matter whether that was in a joiner's workshop kitchen, or in, for instance, a clergyman's kitchen, or in the alehouse kitchen. There would always be something on the go. Farmers always have it on the go, 24 hours a day. So there was always a hot meal available whenever you needed it. And you would basically just keep it going. Again, using either half water, half milk, sometimes all milk, and you would use it to boil up vegetables and grains. Grains such as rye, again rye, wheat, that sort of thing. But now you would be adding in things like beets, parsnip, turnip, carrots, that sort of thing. You might add beans into it or peas, and you might even add a little bit of lamb or some pork. You generally wouldn't have beef because that was reserved for the nobility, but you would usually, as a serf or a tenant farmer or a peasant farmer, have something a little bit more substantial to add into it. And you could keep that going all the time. Again, apart from during times of famine, there would be always something there to eat. Now that would be available 24 hours a day within most manor houses as well, most castles. There'd be always a pot of pottage on the go, so that workers, kitchen staff, servants, even members of the household, if they were hungry, could go down to the kitchen and there would always be something ready there for them to eat. And it would be a lot more substantial. For instance, in a manor house, you would definitely have added herbs to add to the flavour. Maybe some wild garlic or some bulb garlic, onions, leeks, that sort of thing. Now, if you look at village life again, ignoring the farms, but you have the tradesmen in and around the village green, they would be growing vegetables in their back garden as well. Leeks, onions, carrots, turnips, all sorts of things. And that would be an addition to whatever they would have to buy. So there was always food on the go. As well as the pottage, you would also have things like sausages. Now your local butcher, your local farmer, whoever was preparing the meat for preservation, as we mentioned in the last video, would be making up sausages as well, using the intestines from whatever animal as the casings. And it's at this time, the end of the 13th, early beginning of the 14th, we start to see the emergence of regional recipes like Lincolnshire sausage, Cumberland sausage, things like that, made to a specific recipe that's become popular in that area. And people would have access to these sausages. You would have black pudding. And now I know a lot of people turn their nose up at the idea of blood pudding, but honestly, it's delicious. 25% dried blood, 75% some kind of flour, like a rye or a barley flour, something like that, with the addition of cut up cubes of pork fat, things like that, and then it would be boiled in the casings, like the intestine casing. And the fact that it's cooked already means you can preserve it for that little bit longer. Put it into the chill house of the local manor, something like that. Hang it up in the rafters to dry, and then when you need it again, you cook it again. Good to go. White sausage, same thing, but with suet rather than blood, with other fats rather than blood. Delicious, beautiful stuff. So you have access to all sorts of things like that as well. You would also have access to, as well as the smoked meats and the salted meats, you would have what would be called a potted meat. And basically you would get a big earthenware jar with a sealable lid, and you would cook up some meat, and you would pack it into the jar till it was full right to the top, and then you would pour in hot gelatin or aspic or something like that while it's still hot, until it comes right up to the top, and then you would put a lid on and you would seal it good and tight. And as it cools down, the gelatin solidifies, or the aspic solidifies, and actually creates a vacuum inside the jar just underneath the level of the lid. Now that vacuum causes preservation. It doesn't cause preservation, it allows for preservation. And you can store potted meats, if the jar stays sealed, for a couple of years almost. So you would have those available. It may be like a jar of potted meat from last year that you come to this time of the year, or earlier, and you get the jar out, and you've got meat available. If you've got 3 or 4 jars of that available, that could last you a month and a half, 2 months of meat, and you literally just pour it out, chop it up, cook it up, and you're good to go. So there's lots of different options for things like that. For the preserved foods, you'd preserve fruit as well in a similar sort of way. You'd boil it up, with sugary syrups from things like sugar beet and that sort of thing. And then you'd put it into a jar and you'd preserve it. You would actually seal the jar and it would be preserved. You wouldn't preserve it to be eaten. You'd actually preserve it to cook with. You would add it into other foods. You'd make pies with it, because pies are really, really popular. Even fruit pies are really, really popular. Meat pies are popular as well. Now, admittedly, you as a peasant farmer, you might not have as much access to pie making and things like that, but at least once a month you'd have something made up. You'd go and buy some flour from the local mill, and your house, like the housewife, like the farmer's wife, once a month at least, possibly once a week, would do some baking, and they'd bake up. Again, food was not as scarce as people are led to believe by films and TV series and things like that. There was a lot of options available. And apart from times of famine, and at certain times of the year, like for instance the middle of the summer, believe it or not, was a little bit harder in terms of gathering food, there was always something available. For instance, where I am now, we're only 5-7 miles from the sea. So you could go to the sea and you could catch fish, shellfish, crabs, lobster, mussels, cockles, lots of different sea fish, lots of different shellfish. There was various seaweeds that are edible, which can be cut up to make and ground up to make flours, as in to bake with, to make bread, lava bread, things like that. Lots of different vegetation, such as kale, is quite commonly available along the seashore. Samphire, which can be cooked and eaten in a similar sort of way to runner beans, but can also be dried and ground up. Wild garlic is really common on the pastures along the seaside, just behind the dunes. Lots of options. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. I think I've rabbited on enough. Now, next weekend is Christmas, so I don't think I'll be doing a video on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, but I think the day before Christmas Eve, I'll do a video and we'll talk about some of the festive foods that were available. What sort of things did people eat for Christmas in the medieval era? Anyway, hope you found that interesting, not too boring. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, keep eating the foods, and we'll talk again next week. Cheers, guys. Yeah, I like that one. I think we'll do that one. That one seems to be good.